to RPLC and RDI for the invitation to present on these two reports that RDI has just published. I'm pleased to have three panelists following on to tell everybody what I should have said, or how I might have said it. So I have an outline, introduction, the context, what is a self-contained labor area, competitiveness, and then just a brief summary of the two reports that were published, and then a summary of the whole presentation. And I'm hoping you can see my, my arrow here, because I'll be using it. But anyway, this presentation is based on two reports just published by the Rural Development Institute. One is on profiling competitive rural regions, and one is on workforce attraction as a dimension of regional competitiveness. And I'm promised to talk for 15 minutes or less, so let me work on the less here. The data on these studies is from the 2001 and 2006 census, so I need to start with a bit of context in this period. And so 2001, 2006, that was before the 2008, 2009 recession, and the employment rate was consistently increasing for a decade up to that point. Here, the employment rate in non-metro was about 72% in the seasonal off months and about 77% in the seasonal on months. And this employment rate generally went up right on through to the start of the recession in 2008. The low months went up and the high months went up. So there's relative optimism and increasing employment rates among the core age workforce over this period up to 2008. Also, in the period of 2001 to 2006, oil prices doubled. So here we have the index of the price of crude oil, 2010 equal to 100. So here it's 100 here in 2010, and the same price level was in 2005, 2006. But from 2001 to 2006, the price of oil doubled. And that had a fairly important impact on some of the results we'll be seeing. So, next part of the talk is, what is a self-contained labor area? SLAs are one way to delineate functional economic areas, FEAs. FEAs are regions where people live together and work together, in the sense that most residents have jobs in the region. There's very little out commuting, and most jobs in the region are held by residents. There's very little out commute, very little in commuting. So because of that, for the whole FEA, the success or the failure of any economic development initiative will stay in the region. And as an aside, I would argue that FEA should have one governance mechanism specifically for economic development initiatives. But also important to notice that there's an E in FEA, which is economic. And so for other issues, you might have different regions, whether you have regional governance for watersheds, schools, hockey leagues, hospitals, tourism, etc. They might be expected to have their own region. And of course, that will cause some confusion, because people will say, what is my region for tourism, which is different than my region for a hockey league, which is different than my school board region. So you can bring, on the practical side, there's some confusion, but on the analytic or theoretical side, it makes more sense to start, I think, from thinking of regions should be separate for each different issue. So specifically, a self-contained labor area is a group of CSDs, incorporated municipalities and incorporated towns, that have strong reciprocal commuting flows, commuting linkages, places linked by commuting. And so I'm arguing that these SLAs are one way to implement these functional economic areas that I was saying. And so these SLAs have been adopted as the regions for the two reports that were published. And maybe, as I've already said, the choice of SLAs to assess competitiveness, I think, is supported for several reasons. People who live and work within the same labor market area have many things in common, specifically their interest in economic development And the impact of the growth or loss of those jobs will be felt by everybody in a defined FEA. And they have an interest in the governance of economic development issues, because it seems to me everybody in the FEA should be able to participate in the governance, because they're all going to win together or lose together. Continuing on SLAs, the Statistics Canada report here with Ash and Monroe, Alessandro, and myself. We only use commuting flows to delineate SLAs. Other factors that may be important, like the presence of a high school, for example, were not included in the current methodology. Therefore, there could be some small places with small commuting flows. In 2006, there's a 1/5 sample for the long-form census, so some commuters would not have been in the sample, and some small census subdivisions would appear to have no commuters, and they'd be classified as their own SLA, because the data would say nobody was commuting out, nobody was commuting in. So small areas get stuck with this current methodology. And contiguity, i.e. commuting would be possible from A to B, but we've had no data. That was not taken into account. Now, for the 2011 SLAs, in an unpublished paper here that's introduced by Alessandro at a 2016 conference of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, he introduced the fact that contiguity was taken into account when they delineated 2011 SLAs. So, what is competitiveness? I think competitiveness essentially means increasing one's market share of whatever output or whatever outcome you're considering. And I'm suggesting that population growth is an excellent indicator of success of a region. But I put a star here because I know many people feel that their community does not need to grow to be a success. And I would agree with them, except many of the same people say, oh, but there's no job here for my kids. And so a bit of growth in population is helpful for new jobs and keeping young people in the community, in my view. So the ability of a region to attract and to retain people comes from both, are you creating jobs in the region, and or is your region a desirable place to live? So places can grow because people want to live there because of the jobs, or they want to live there because it's a nice place to live. So therefore, I'm saying if an SLA is growing faster than the average SLA in your peer group, that SLA would be competitive. You're increasing your market share of the population in your country or in your peer group faster than the others. So in the report, we had 6 competitiveness groups. We had lower, neutral, higher, competitive within each of 2 peer groups, larger and smaller population groups. So I try not to spend too much time in this table, but the smaller SLAs were just those with 100,000 residents or less, and larger SLAs more than 100,000 residents. So these 2 peer groups. Within those peer groups, we had 3 competitiveness groups, and here in the lower competitiveness group, within small SLAs, growth was less than 4%. So the average was -2%. Neutral, I just decided, somewhat arbitrarily, neutral would be 2% plus or minus 2%. So that's why it's -4 to 0 in neutral. Lower competitiveness grew less than this, and higher competitiveness grew greater than 0. And so these groups are growing 2 percentage points or more faster than the average in the period from 2001 to 2006. The same thing over here, the competitiveness groups on the larger SLA grew more than 6% over 5 years. Now, 6% over 5 years is not much faster than the Canadian population as a whole, so that's not a great group. That's 1.2% a year on average, so it's not fast growth. But these 11 SLAs, larger SLAs, grew 2 percentage points faster than the average SLA. So one of our reports was profiling competitive regions. Our profile shows characteristics. We're not showing the factors causing competitiveness, which I hope our panelists pick up on. So among smaller SLAs, the lower competitive ones, this bar is number of self-contained areas. So there are 193 SLAs, and they had about 1 million people overall. And the higher competitive SLAs, larger, higher competitive, I think there were 19 of those, and their total population was 12.5 million overall for all 19 SLAs. So here we can see 12 million higher competitive people living in higher competitive SLAs, almost 12 million living in neutral competitive larger SLAs. So these are 12 and 12, that's 24 million out of a population of 30 million in Canada. So a lot of Canadians were living in neutral or higher competitive larger SLAs. But there are a lot of communities and regions and functional economic areas. I'm going to back up. Lots of regions here, 193, over 70 regions, almost 100 regions here. So many smaller self-contained labor areas, largely in rural areas. Here's looking at the change in the number of young adults. And lower competitive areas had a negative or decline in the number of young adults. In this period, 96 to 2001, a decline of maybe 12 or 13%, a decline of 14%. Higher competitive, smaller SLAs had small net growth, but the higher competitive, larger SLAs had a much higher growth than the other groups, maybe 11% growth in those two periods of their younger population. And the higher competitive, larger SLAs had a higher share of immigrants in their population. These immigrants might have arrived in Canada 20 or 30 years ago, so it's a total number of immigrants, total number of people born outside Canada as percent of the total population. If you go to the higher competitive, larger SLAs, about 1 in 3 people would be born outside Canada. In the neutral SLAs, we're down here at 14 or 15%. 1 in 7 were born outside Canada. And in the other groups of SLAs, 5 or 6% were born outside Canada. The other report we published was on migration and as a measure of workforce attraction. I think the first thing to note is that from 2001 to 2006, 2.3 million individuals moved from one SLA to another. 2.3 million people moved labor markets, changed their labor markets, moved from one functional economic area to another. I don't know if that's big or small, but I'm thinking 2.3 out of 30 million may be big. Here we have the smaller SLAs, the lower competitiveness group. They percent migrating across SLAs. 14% moved out of those SLAs, but 9% moved in, so the out minus the in was a 5% net decline. But there were 9% moving in to smaller, lower competitiveness SLAs. So there's good news here. It's just that there's more bad news. Click too many buttons. And then there was a negative change due to migration. Net migration was negative. Net migration was negative. Here, net migration was slightly positive in these smaller self-contained labor areas that were higher in the higher competitiveness group. They lost lots of people, 14%, but they gained 15%, so it's a net gain of 1%. So for SLAs in this group, I don't know if it's possible to work on attracting more, but it might be possible on trying to retain more that we're moving out. Small negative net migration here, neutral here, small positive net migration in percent terms. But remember, there's lots of people in these groups, 12 million here and 12 million here. So this is the fairly big absolute number, even though it's small in relative terms. Here we're looking at the youth migrating, and the lower competitiveness group lost maybe 34%, gained 10%, so lost 24%. Lots of people moving out. Some youth moved into lower competitive self-contained areas, smaller ones, but still the net change was minus 24%. Negative here, negative here, negative here. The young people were moving to, on a net basis, neutral competitiveness SLAs that are larger, or higher competitiveness SLAs that were larger. And here's the percent of immigrants who are migrating. So if you came to Canada before 2001 and you're an immigrant, did you stay where you were? Did you move? Well, negative, you lost more immigrants than came in. So you lost 19% of your immigrants, you gained 10% of your immigrants in that period, so you lost 10%. Negative here, the smaller SLAs that were higher competitive were slightly more attractive for immigrants who are moving. So you did lose 15%, but you did gain 16 or 17%, so it's plus 2% on a net basis. The percent mobility here is small, but again, those are big absolute numbers. But small negative, and bigger SLAs, small gain, just a small gain. So those are a quick overview of profiling and the migration among the SLAs. And so if you read the reports, there's lots of stuff in it. But I think we see that higher competitive regions have a larger share of young adults and a smaller share of seniors. Higher competitive regions have a largest share of immigrants, certainly among the larger SLAs. And in the report, it shows that higher competitive regions have higher employment rates and a larger share with higher levels of higher education, or educational attainment. So these are some of the main characteristics of higher competitive regions. And the migration report basically shows migration patterns that reinforce or contribute to these results. So I think I'll end there. I hope the questions and answers will come for the panelists and not for me. So I will stop here and turn it back to Monique.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Ray for the presentation and the reports, which I found to be really, really interesting. I do joke that I'm largely a social scientist, pretty heavy on the social there, so I'm not going to dissect Ray's statistics. I'm really underqualified to do that. But what I want to focus my presentation on is some kind of reactions, reflections, and implications of what I think of what I was thinking of when I read these reports, and what do these reports mean? What can we take away from them for what we're going to do and how we're going to act heading forward in rural Canada? And because I'm here talking on behalf of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, I'm going to try and stick to the broader overarching kind of national level, but I will use some examples from my local region. Sorry, technical glitch. There we go. Before I get into my reactions about Ray's report, I did want to take a brief second to put in a shameless plug about SURF for those who are unfamiliar with us. Basically, we're a volunteer organization aimed at revitalizing a sustainable rural Canada through collaborative research and education. I put up a number of websites there, and I don't want to take away from the focus of this presentation, but I will say that we are hosting our annual conference and annual general meeting in my hometown of Nelson, BC this year. And if you're interested, you can contact me afterwards or take a look at the websites that I have up there. All right, reaction-wise. So I first want to talk about my initial reactions to reading the report and kind of some of the thoughts that immediately jumped to mind when I was reading through this. And I've stolen one of the maps from Ray's report and put it up there. And so at first, when I was reading through it, I wanted to think about what does rural look like when I look at this map. And so rural being the 3 shades of green, so under 100,000. I was looking through and I see a real mix of uncompetitive, stable, and competitive rural places. See some really interesting clusters of rural places that surround what I know to be urban areas. I see some things that make me nod my head, and I see another couple of shaded colors that made me raise my eyebrows a little bit, just in terms of kind of what I know from either living in places or being familiar with them, and what I see reflected on the map. And then, the second thing that I thought of is this question of chicken and egg. And I know that Ray's report looks very specifically at one piece. But when I get into thinking about people and population growth and competitiveness, it does make me roll that question around in my head of, are these places competitive because they have those people moving in, or are they attracting those people and retaining those people because they're competitive? And I'm going to go ahead and assume that it's probably both, but that there are those other factors that Ray mentioned that are driving these things, whether it's employment or amenities or other social considerations. And that'll come in a little bit later in my presentation. And then my third initial reaction was one around development and growth. And this is a really interesting conversation that I think just is something that I wanted to flag up, because I'm really aware that growth, whether it's growth in people or GDP or profits, are very much a go-to measurement. But it is important, and it's something that we need to bring into the conversation, that one, infinite growth isn't possible. I mean, not the least of which because our planet won't sustain that. And you know, when I think of my community, for example, it's wedged between a lake and a mountain. There's really only so many places it could go. But growth is also a quantitative measure of those change and the numbers of change, and it's a really good indication. But I also like to talk about development and on that qualitative side of those changes occurring. So not just how many people are moving in, but are those people contributing to their community? Are they going to be a part of the community, or are they moving in on a temporary work placement and not participating? Those are the types of questions that come to mind when I read reports like this, because I like to use this information to springboard and dig into those larger questions. Okay, so reflecting a little bit on what it means to be competitive. I think previously when we would talk about economic development, particularly in rural places, it was very much the comparative advantage model. Basically, the advantage that we have because of the existence or the quality of the resources that we have. So we have more widgets, therefore we're going to make widgets. And some places and people really still think that way, and you can see it in the models of how they're trying to develop or in how they're trying to bring people into their places or keep people into their places. But recently, people have started looking a little bit beyond that into the idea of competitive advantage. So looking a little bit wider at all of the quantitative and qualitative variables that are inherent in a place and that make our places able to retain and attract the people that we want, make us able to develop into the future. And that leads me into a second point, which is one of the reasons that I like this idea of functioning at a regional level. So when you have larger towns, you have this ability to have lots and lots of assets. But when you have communities of 500 or 1,000 or 2,000, you don't have as many assets. And so I have, for example, one community that's just behind my computer that focuses a lot on big box stores and chain stores, and that's kind of their niche, whereas the community that's behind me this way focuses more on boutique shops and kind of that particular niche. Neither of those communities is large enough on their own do both of those things, but together they form a really functional region. And I think on one of Ray's diagrams, they're actually that labor area that he was looking at. And so just this idea of the role of regions, the role of urban, or I say urban-ish because my urban places are not that large, to act together, to bring together all those assets that we need for development. I realize I'm going slightly over time here, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. And then this idea of tackling retention, and basically that whether you want slow growth or no growth or lots of growth, you're still going to have to retain people, because, as you know, whether it's jobs for young people coming up in your community, or frankly replacing some of our aging population, we're going to need to retain people moving forward. Implications from the report. I've recently worked on a project that kind of explored this idea of new regionalism, and I'm not going to get into that one because I don't really have time. But I want to build on these points of governance and integration, and I know that Ray mentioned this a little bit, but I want to spend my last minute or two talking about functional regions. And so this is my region, and I'm going to use this example, but I'm sure everyone can relate to this, and Ray did touch on this a little bit earlier. There's 160,000 people who live here. There's about 30 municipalities, hundreds of unincorporated areas, multiple regional districts. You have labor regions, you have watersheds, you've got health regions, skiing regions, school districts, climate zones, all of those different things that we have to contend with. Recently, I've seen a lot of papers and proposals around a better way to divide up our space. You know, instead of having it in these 3 regions, we should actually divide it into 6, or instead of having just one policy for rural, we should, you know, divide it into 9 different categories, or whatever the number is. And what I want to highlight is, and I believe Ray mentioned this as well, is that you're never going to have a single line on the map that captures everything. It's just not possible. So when we talk about implications, and what I was hoping to bring to the discussion, and I apologize to everybody else for going over time here, is just a question around, when we think about policies and programs, and when we think about the results of reports like the one that Ray have written and putting it all together into action, can we create policies that allow us to be specific to the rural context? Because we all know that it's not only different from urban, but what's rural in BC and what we need is different from what's needed on the other side of the country. But how can we allow ourselves and create policies that support working in these functional regions, working in regions that make sense for all the topics that we're working on, but how to get those multiple overlapping regions to work together? So if I'm working on watersheds, which is a lot of the work that I'm doing, that I can also work with those functional labor regions, because, and the local governments, because those are the people and the places that sit within my watershed. At any rate, I've gone well over, so I will just say thank you, and I believe I'm turning it over to Ruth.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ray. Really interesting research, and I just want to start off by saying that when I read research like this, I tend to put my economic development practitioner hat on. Most of the work that I do involves developing resources and information for rural communities and regions, and basically trying to look at best practices. So when I read this, my fallback was, how does this research impact rural communities and what they could strive to become? So, but there were a few different unique things and unique situations in Manitoba that I noticed. First of all, 8 of the 10 smaller high competitive regions in Ray's research in Manitoba, 8 of them were Northern First Nations regions. And so defining that as competitive, I don't know if you looked at other economic indicators whether you would necessarily agree that they were competitive, but the other 2 definitely were. And Manitoba is unique because it has only one large region, and so some of that was unique to Manitoba. But looking at the Competitive Rural Regions report, In Manitoba, there were the 8 smaller high competitive regions, and 2 of those were Winkler, Morden, Altona region and Brandon, which you would definitely probably consider those as fairly competitive regions. And when you looked at the smaller, low competitive regions in Manitoba, almost every one of them was single dependent, was a single industry dependent region, dependent on agriculture. So I just found that kind of interesting. And the findings from the first report were that smaller, high competitive regions have a higher share of young adults, they have a higher share of immigrants, a lower prevalence of low-income families, and a higher share of employment in those different industries. So my question was, even though there is no causality studied in the research, do these findings suggest characteristics that a region could strive for? So in other words, I asked myself, to become more competitive, should you strive for population growth through immigration? Should you strive for industry diversification? And as I read some other research to see if there was some causality, I did find some research that backed that up. So I'm going to keep going. And then I'll back up to the first point on this slide, so that communities with single industry strengths, such as agriculture and mining, are at risk when that industry declines. And I think that is really apparent after 2008 in oil and gas and mining in Manitoba. So if you're a community and you've got your economic development practitioner hat on, and if you wanted to strive for the characteristics of a competitive region, could you do things like this? Focus on attracting young families, improving the quality of life, focus on becoming a welcoming community for immigrants. And I believe that Ray's study mentioned that the longer that newcomers stay in a community, the more inclined they are to stay. Should you be focusing on entrepreneurship to help diversify the economy or build on the competitive strengths that you have? Should you examine local industry strengths and encourage business investment to build on those strengths and do things like fill supply chain gaps? And I remember being at a conference one time and asking Ray, what should rural communities be doing? And he said, well, you got to find something new to export. So I'm stealing this from you, Ray. And I think maybe rural communities, could you look at trying to attract more talent and knowledge economy people to your community? And to do that, you really need to have, your community needs to be connected, it needs to be beautiful and a great place to raise family. And another thought that I had was, could you look at your expats or those young people that went away to university? How do you attract them back to home? Another thing, how do you support industry sectors of strength? And construction was identified as having higher relative labor in the higher competitive communities. So could you look at industries like that have strength? And so what do you do as a region? Can you look at mentorship programs, local investment groups to support young tradespeople, those kinds of things? So if small, high competitive regions also have strength in accommodation and food, this is likely tourism. So if you want to be more competitive, can you think of ways to bring people to your community for festivals? Can you expand cottage lots, ecotourism? And Brandon, in the Manitoba example, is a good example of that, where their ag center brings all sorts of events and activities to the community that helps expand the population as well. In the second study that Ray mentioned on the workforce attraction and the migration, the smaller, high competitive regions have a higher net flow of the working age people, people with post-secondary education, immigrants that came and stayed, and they also have the second highest net flow of seniors. So again, taking a look at from the practitioner level, if you want to strive for those characteristics in your community, what could you do, or possibly what could you do? Again, focus on attracting young families, but making sure that you've got those quality of life things that young families are looking for. Can you look at the focus on quality of life for seniors and helping seniors in your community to age in place so that they don't leave for assisted living facilities outside of the region? can you provide incentives for higher education to bring those university-educated kids back to your community? And providing support for entrepreneurship to focus on diversification. And that's it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to try and get my share screen to work. And can everybody see this okay? Yes. Excellent, thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name is Scott McCullough from the Institute of Urban Studies. I as well will just let you know a little bit about the IUS so you know who we are. We're an independent research arm of the university, and we've been around since 1969. We were founded by Lloyd Axworthy. And the Institute focuses primarily on issues of the inner city and urban development issues. And my work primarily focuses around housing and homelessness. That's our website down there. And if you just Google IUS, we're really easy to find. So Sarah and Ruth have really identified a lot of the key issues I thought were pertinent in these reports. So I'm just going to be kind of expanding on those points a bit and maybe hopefully adding my 2 cents, maybe addressing some other urban regional concerns and strategies. Ruth identified that there's no causality in this research, and I think that's really important. The papers present profiles of communities that are successfully competitive, but don't really tell us how a community gets there. I thought maybe one way to address causality would be to add a time element and identify SLAs that have moved, for instance, from non-competitive to competitive over the last 20 years. And then we could pinpoint the policies and actions an SLA used to affect that change. This would essentially be creating case studies for learnings of best practices or common mistakes. Now, this is no different actually than many of the ideas that Ruth presented, but it might ground it a little bit more in causality. And this, I think, would show us what we want to know, which is what does the research suggest a community, region, SLA should do? And I think there's some really great case studies across the country, but Manitoba ones I know, where they've grown tremendously over the last 2 decades with particular success in attracting new immigrants and diversifying local economies. But importantly, we would see indications of how communities localize their strategies, which is something I think Sarah touched on as well. So what would localized strategies look like? Let's think about immigration for a minute. Lots of rural areas want to attract new immigrants, but some are more successful than others. One thing that I notice is that some rural areas, I'm thinking here of, again, the Winkler, Morden, Steinbach areas of Manitoba, had very high success in attracting new immigrant population, mostly through the provincial nominee program. But their strategies were, their actions were very strategic. They targeted cultural groups very similar to their communities. They ensured jobs were available and partnered with private immigration consultants who locate potential immigrants in their home countries. I see a similar kind of localization adaptation regarding youth. I know of a couple of small communities that have rethought their strategies around youth. and instead of trying to do youth retention, are moving towards more of a local repatriation strategy. Ruth touched on this as well. And this is where a community recognizes the challenge of keeping youth in the community, and so support the migration of youth to larger, more competitive areas for education and career development. But then they remain in contact. And when the expat is older and perhaps starting a family or wanting or looking for a different lifestyle, they target them specifically for repatriation back into their home communities. And this is a particularly strong strategy because the community brings back not just one person, but a whole family with their education, skills, and wealth into that rural community. When I think of this, I'm thinking in particular of Member 2 First Nation in Nova Scotia, which has a very, very clear policies on repatriation of their people after they leave for education and skills development. But I'm also thinking of a couple of small Manitoba Francophone communities that have started along that path. So, some regional thoughts I had about the two reports. I really enjoyed Sarah's map on functional regions, which clearly shows the challenges in thinking regionally. And I'd just like to add one little point to that, something she touched on, but I think could be a little bit expanded upon. Ray's two papers use self-contained labor market areas, which by definition is a functional economic area and can be thought of as an economic development area. Generally, we assume smaller SLAs are weaker on their own, but stronger when there's coordination of resources and supports across a region. But the problem with using SLAs for this kind of analysis is that they're artificial boundaries or groupings where there's no real region. The challenge is how many of these SLAs have a governance structure for that SLA to do planning and affect change. I would argue very few. And even for those with a structure that is, even for those who have a governance structure, such as the Manitoba Capital Region, that sort of matches the SLA, there are significant challenges aligning the desires and policies of multiple communities, and then aligning planning, resources, and initiatives to actually achieve some ends. The papers also suggested to me a couple of urban implications. One thing that isn't talked about a lot is that rural SLAs and areas are really critical to the economy and success of urban areas. I'd like to refer to another set of papers that Ray did a couple of years ago, the rural fact sheets, as examples of this. They showed that for Manitoba, non-urban areas constitute 35% of the Manitoba economy and nearly 40% of the population. That's, I think, everything outside of the Manitoba Capital Region. And rural areas provide 34% of jobs in Manitoba. So large segments of the urban economy rely on the health of rural areas, and it's imperative that large SLAs kind of recognize that relationship and the value of rural SLAs. Another last couple of points here I have. One thing that seemed really clear about urban implication is everybody wants to grow, but it's a challenge for large competitive SLAs to be the primary destination for everybody, for migrants, for new immigrants. Ray identified one of the problems at the end of his migration paper, the polarization patterns resulting from attracting individuals in higher skilled occupations who would theoretically have higher incomes, as well as attracting those living in low income households. And this creates a polarization effect within urban areas. And I'd like to add an additional one to that, which is the effects on the housing market. High flows of population to larger competitive SLAs drive high demand for housing, resulting in rising housing prices. We only need to think of Toronto and Vancouver as examples of this, but many other cities on Ray's list of higher competitive SLAs are also seeing rapid increases in housing, or sorry, prices for housing. And these two problems in particular, the income social polarization and the high costs of housing, are incredibly challenging for cities to address. So that's just a thought on that. My very last thought is, in all of these things we've said, there seems to be a really strong role for governments to take place to have an effect on the development of rural SLAs. And I think I'll leave that there for now. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for that presentation. I have a question here from Helen, and let me just unmute. And she's saying, if SLAs are delineated on the basis of community flows, would you consider this physical mobility between sites? Or is there a limit on the community distance in this methodology? Should we also consider competitiveness of rural regions from the perspective of telecommuting? How might that change the methodology or the results?
It's a good question, Helen. On the first thing is, was there a limit on the physical mobility between sites? The original, the data would show that Purdue, Saskatchewan is in the same SLA as Fort McMurray because there's so much commuting back and forth. Well, you know, the commuting data is place of residence, place of work. And so a whole bunch of people said their place of residence was Purdue, Saskatchewan, just outside of Saskatoon, and their place of work was Fort McMurray, and those got linked because of commuting flows. Well, it certainly isn't daily commuting, as you can imagine. And I actually forget if the present study put those 2 or 3 examples in or not. I forget how they were handled. But Alessandro and the subsequent stuff had worried more about contiguity. So there is no limit on commuting distance except for ones that are obviously not daily commuting. But could some places be the same labor market due to telework or telecommuting? And the answer is yes. From time to time, Statistics Canada looks at how many people work from home, and the numbers are not increasing that much. Excuse me. You would expect the numbers to be increasing more than the data are showing. And if you send me an email and remind me, I can see if I can dig out those numbers. So I'm not sure how much the data would change if we looked at teleworking to define a more a different type of labor market.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowman. There's another question also from David, and he says, do you know of any data or reports that look at the presence or absence of public libraries in rural communities, and how or whether that affects rural competitiveness?
Offhand, I do not know. I think I may have seen in the past public libraries included in 1 or 2 studies of, do public libraries, is that associated with population growth or community competitiveness or community happiness or community success? But off the top, I cannot think of one study that's done that. And therefore, there are not a lot that I'm aware of. I'm not sure I'm in the right person to ask. I'm not necessarily in that loop of looking at that type of factors associated with community success. So the other panel members may be more familiar with that than I am.
I just add to that when we were, not with surf, so taking off my surf hat and putting on my Selkirk College hat, annually we produce a report called the State of the Basin, and that's an indicator report that includes demographics and a number of other indicators. And we wanted to include public libraries as well, number of public libraries, hours, use, programs, those types of things. And we were unable to find a report or a specific source to use. So we ended up basically having to approach the different library boards and put that together ourselves. Thankfully, the library boards in this area do a great job of tracking those types of things. But yeah, we were unable to find an actual report that was useful.
All right, and we don't have any other questions so far. So if anyone has any other questions?
Monique, Norman Regatley with the Rural Ontario Institute has typed in another column here on the webinar chat that the ROI, the Rural Ontario Institute, has a newcomer and youth attractiveness indicator system for each census subdivision, I think, in Ontario. And they do include cultural amenities and library data. So thanks, Norm. I was familiar, but I didn't with that data set, but I didn't know all the variables that were in it. So contact Norm at ROI for more information on that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to send them through the question and answer box. And if our panelists have any final thoughts or any closing statements, you could get that ready. We'll see how that goes. Yeah.
I did have a question for Ruth or Ray or Scott, whoever wants to answer. We've been noting, and this, I was going to mention this in my talk and then I drastically ran out of time, but we've been noting spousal employment as being one of the largest challenges that we're finding for retaining people. So we can attract people, particularly people to fill high skills positions, but their spouses, so that that wife or the husband that they're coming with can't find a job or can't find a job in their field, and we're losing those people. And I was wondering if anybody had seen examples of how that's been tackled in other places.
Sorry, Sarah.
Damn it.
But you know, universities are a bit proactive of finding a job for the spouse, but in general, I don't know of any good examples.
Nor do I, although I've also heard rumors of the same problem. I don't know of any data on it either, or any case studies.
Yeah, it's a super tough one. They did have a meeting with one economic development practitioner who expressed that once she, because it would always be she in his mind, started looking after their kids, that there wouldn't be an issue with spousal employment anymore. But I kindly informed the gentleman that that really wasn't a solution to the problem.
Well, I've got a couple of comments on the panelists there. One is on Sarah's map of regions all over the place, and that's the reality. I might point to a study, I guess it's a PhD thesis of a woman at the Agricultural Economics Research Institute in The Hague in the Netherlands. And her PhD was going to different regions around Europe and talking about basically competitiveness or success or performance of regions. And sometimes you would find a region where most of these boundaries overlapped. And there's good news and there's bad news. Everybody knew everybody, and either they knew how to get along or they didn't know how to get along, and they knew who to phone up for watershed or libraries or soccer leagues or whatever, compared to places where there's a different set of boundaries for everything. And the board changes every 3 or 4 years. You just don't know who to phone now. You used to know a year ago, but who do you phone now? Because you're not in constant overlap with these people. So it's very difficult for the governance to have all these boundaries out there, except for each individual issue. It makes sense to have separate boundaries. So her report on that was quite helpful for hitting me between the eyes on that one. On Scott talking about being nice to have the data on the mobility, how many SLAs change their status over time. A while ago, I did a report and did some tables using Census Consolidated Subdivisions, CCS, A CCS is, say, a town like Rivers, Manitoba, and the municipality around called Daly. So you put those two CSDs together and get a CCS. So it's sort of at the community level. And then over time, how many communities change their status? And the one, I have to look at it again because it's been a while since I looked at it. But the one number I recall over 5 or 10 years, 2/3 of the communities in the lower group were stuck in the lower group. That sounds bad. The good news was 1/3 of the communities in the lower group were able to graduate out to a higher group. So the glass is either 2/3 empty or 1/3 full on that one.
I'd be interested. I'd be interested in that report if
yeah. Send me an email and I will start my search for it. And also, Scott, on your just pointing that SLAs have no governance structure, I would note that in Eastern Canada, ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, put out some contracts for studies with Memorial University to come up with the functional economic regions as a proposal for creating regions for development, economic development, actually trying to put regions on the ground and bring in governance mechanisms. I don't know how far the action went, but certainly there's a number of reports on the proposals.
Interesting.
I think the problem with that particular approach is that you're just adding another line, and you're
another layer of bureaucracy.
Yeah, and another committee or another subgroup or another governance structure that isn't well understood or isn't well accepted or socially ingrained or anything like that. It's really challenging. It's tempting, but it doesn't necessarily work very well. A lot of or at least from my perspective, much of the literature points to the need to better integrate all of the existing layers instead of adding another one or trying to replace one of them.
Mm-hmm. Not an easy process either.
No. Thanks, guys. This has been fun.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this webinar. Thank you to our panelists and our participants who joined us and the questions that were asked. We thank you very much. This webinar will be posted to our RPLC YouTube channel, so feel free to share it with your networks and keep sharing it so this information could be reached to the persons who will be able to use it to make the necessary policy changes that we need. Thanks everyone again, and see you next week for another webinar. We'll be looking on regional districts in British Columbia, and that will be on the 6th of September. And have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.